These lands are deeply connected to Indigenous peoples who have historically lived and who currently live in these territories. I recognize that these particular lands have always been the source of learning for Indigenous peoples, and I invite you to commit with me to respect the traditional knowledge that has been derived from these lands and to learn from the Indigenous experiences on them. The University of Regina's Alumni Department, together with the Lifelong Learning Center, is pleased to be able to offer the Research with Impact series virtually. I hope that your time with us today deepens your curiosity to learn about historical Indigenous experiences in Canada and the impact those experiences have in present day. And I also hope you will be motivated to return for future sessions. Now, I should point out that these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the U of R alumni webpage so that you can watch the presentations again or share them with your friends and family. You'll see the link to the alumni website in the chat if you'd like to access the video later. There it is. And now it's my honor to introduce our third speaker in the University of Regina's 2021 Research with Impact series, Dr. Raven Sinclair. We're so glad that you're joining us. Dr. Sinclair is a 60 Scoop survivor and University of Regina professor and researcher. She has studied the 60 Scoop and Indigenous child welfare in Canada for 2 decades, most recently with the support of a 5-year Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Insight Grant. Today, Dr. Sinclair will discuss what the Scoop is and share some of her experiences as a Cree woman raised in a white family. She will also discuss why research is important as a tool for providing evidence-based recommendations for policy and program changes to welfare. Following her presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for a question and answer session. Hertha from Lifelong Learning Center will be moderating the Q&A. As you listen to Dr. Sinclair's presentation, please put your questions in the chat feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Hertha will share them with Dr. Sinclair shortly after her presentation ends, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as time allows. And now it's my honor to turn the floor over to Dr. Sinclair. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for showing up, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the warm introduction and the land acknowledgement. I really appreciate it. Okay, so it's a real thrill to be here, and I keep hearing a little beep. Perhaps I'll mute anyone else who's not muted yet. Okay, so tanse kahkia no ako magnak otskuapit na sigason posa kanachik oschinia kita tamaskat noao. And I also want to give thanks to the people that are doing this series, because it's really important opportunities for us to share what it is that we're doing. So my name is Raven Sinclair. I'm from George Gordon First Nation in Treaty 4. And I am a 60 Scoop survivor. I was well, I'll start with this cover image because it's significant to me. So I'm going to be talking to you about basically my 5-year Insight Grant, which is the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. We're at the tail end of 5 years, but COVID tended to slow things down, so we're going to be taking another year, possibly a year and a half, to do our to finish up the project. It's quite massive in scope, and I'm excited to share it with you. But this image here, so I was in Kingston a few years ago with my daughter Mercedes, and that's her sitting there looking at this picture. And what struck me about it was we just came across a Kent Monkman display at a gallery on Queen's University campus. And his work is absolutely phenomenal. If this picture certainly doesn't do it justice. The colors are incredibly vibrant and it's massive. I think this is probably about 8 feet by 10 or 15. And it was, it struck me that it was sort of the first time that my daughter had, just really become entranced with a piece of art. And the other thing that struck me was that, this image, of course, is of the RCMP supporting the missionaries, the Catholic Church people, to come and take children to residential schools. And this scenario also played out in the 60s Scoop as well. But this is about the residential schools. And, I was thinking that I'm so grateful that I have a child who doesn't have to experience these things, this removal from family, community, and culture. Now, she is an intergenerational survivor, and so she reminds me that my overprotectiveness and is really my own trauma coming out, and I should just really keep it to myself. So she really makes me think, and yeah, I'm very overprotective. Um, I'll just move on ahead. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my own story. So these are Nigawi Egwanotawi, my mother and my father, Raven Sinclair, and Ruth Pelche. Sorry, my mouse is notoriously slippery. Maybe I'll just use my keyboard. I'll try that. So the top left is my father, who was a farm laborer, and then my mother, Ruth Pelche. My father was from Kawakatus, my mother was from Gordon's. And on the right there is my adoption ready photograph. And, when I looked at that picture, I thought, I look so happy. And, now from this place, 55 years later, I was a really happy kid up until that point of being removed and placed into a very foreign environment. I had a very large, loving family. We didn't have a lot of money. We had a lot of poverty, but I was always taken care of, and they gave me a sense of belonging and a feistiness that has stayed with me, for the duration of my life. The bottom two pictures, this is my adoptive family, and I love them. I want to say that. My experience was a real mixture of awesomeness and terrible horribleness. My both of my parents are now deceased, and I was very, very connected with them. My father was one of my best friends, one of my greatest champions, and I think without him, I don't know that I would have survived my experience. These images are of us landing in Amsterdam. So this is shortly after I was placed in this family. My father went on sabbatical in West Germany, and so we went there for just over a year, and I started school in a little village outside of University City by the name of Tübingen. I went to school in a little village called Vankheim, and yes, I speak German a little bit, ein bisschen still. And this picture here was, I had quite a tumultuous relationship with my adoptive mother. She was a product of her own time, and we believe that she was probably a child of abuse as well, and so she perpetrated that physical, mental, emotional, and psychological abuse onto me. And so when I look at this image on the right here, she had just finished berating me for something and then wanted me to smile for the camera. So it was quite a confusing time. And my experience was really a combination of advantages, lots of advantages. I went to summer camp. I took all kinds of lessons. We traveled a fair bit, mostly in Canada. And, I was surrounded by a fairly, small knit group of supportive human beings, because my father was a theologian and a United Church minister. And so I was able to experience some acceptance in that context. Outside of that context, it was another story. I don't think there was a day that went by that I didn't experience some sort of abuse, and often violence, because just simply by virtue of the fact that I was brown and being raised in an upper white middle class, WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant context for the most part. So it was very difficult. I felt very alone and isolated, and in retrospect, I went into post-traumatic stress shock pretty much immediately upon my removal, and stayed there until I was about 23 years old. So it was I was very removed from myself, dislocated from myself, and I think that my experience, in the continuum of stories, and there's there's stories on in that whole continuum. So some that are real nightmares that we wouldn't wish upon anyone, and then other stories that are really really positive and awesome. And that's, I think that's what child welfare, we hope child welfare is about, is that it intervenes and creates a nurturing and loving context for kids when they're in need of alternative care. But unfortunately, when we look across the country and we look at the stories and some of the outcomes, many of the outcomes, I would say the majority, the ideal was not met, and that's what's most problematic about it. And also the fact that the 60s Scoop really, it has an important sort of place in our collective colonial history. So as I grew up, I didn't last long in school. I went to grade 10 and I really couldn't tolerate the social ostracism and isolation and the bullying. And so I dropped out in grade 10, and I was done with it. I couldn't manage it. I did go back to school, and ended up in school in university in 1981 when I was 20, and have basically stayed there ever since. And again, I attribute that to my father's influence, that there was something about academia that was more of a safe space for me. But one of my motivations for going into academia and continuing my education was that I wanted to find out what happened to me. Because when I was a kid, I thought I was the only one. And, as I reached emancipation and started going out into the world on my own, I started to meet other 60 Scoop survivors and other adoptees. And, I thought, I was meeting more and more, and I thought, well, okay, it wasn't just me. So what is this thing? Why did this happen? And, I didn't, I started at University of Toronto in an arts degree. And I didn't really learn about colonial history until 1995. So this is like, I'd been in university for, 12 years by this time, 13 years. And when I was finishing my first undergraduate degree, I took up Indian social work, and I went to the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, and that's where I really got my history. It was, that whole program was really infused with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous content, and so that's where I really really understood. And so this image here is of the Fort Capella Industrial School, and I come from 5 generations of residential school survivors, so I have relatives that attended this school, and it was a brutal place. And the teepees in the front there are the parents and relatives of the kids in the school, and that was the closest they could get to seeing their kids, and they would camp there, so at least the kids would know that they were there. And I imagine that later on policy prevented that sort of interaction. And that, the separation of children from families, that goes back to the 1600s with the Jesuit missionaries who recognized, well, what they said was that Indigenous children were raised with such autonomy and such love and nurturing that they were not teachable. They couldn't Christianize them, and they couldn't thereby civilize them, because if the children didn't like what they were being taught, they would get up and walk away. They would leave and go home. And so it was in the 1600s that the Jesuits said, we need to separate the children from their families so that we can really teach them and civilize them, and then they'll become good citizens. And so the residential school was the first sort of real massive approach, large-scale approach at assimilation. And there really was no doubt about it. Some of the other sort of approaches to assimilation and the means to achieve assimilation were the destruction of our traditional economies. So that image there is buffalo skulls, and that's we still refer to Regina as Palabones, because it was a location where the hundreds of thousands of skulls and bones that were amassed from the slaughter of the buffalo on the prairies, they were gathered and shipped by train to the east, to some of the industrial factories and so on, and overseas. And And then that's an image of residential schools. And when I first saw this picture, I was very, very young, and I remember thinking, "Oh, look at their hair's all cut and tidy and nice and neat." And now I look at it, and what I see is trauma, and yeah, just unhappiness, sort of the embodiment of physical unhappiness and anxiety. So it concerns me. So when we look at history, for me, it was really important to go back and understand, well, why would settlers want to assimilate Indigenous people? Why not come here and just coexist? But when we look back at this is just the turn of the century. We can go back to the Enlightenment period and look at the works of Hobbes and Locke and Machiavelli and so on, and they had really strong ideas about how the world should be ordered. And they also had pretty clear ideas about Indigenous peoples globally, and that we were subhuman. So here's a couple of more contemporary thinkers that really have had an impact, I think, in the Commonwealth for sure, and then in Canada in particular. So this gentleman on the right here, he said, "We know the size of the world and we know the total extent. It's our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." So this man was an imperialist and clearly, a racist. And he made a lot of money by going into Zimbabwe and Zambia and diamond mining for diamonds, using the people of those countries to amass a significant amount of wealth. And his wealth, he's long gone, because this was, at the turn of the century. He's long gone, but his legacy still stands. And what's interesting is that even today, we have the best and the brightest of students compete for scholarships in his name to go and study at Oxford on scholarship. So, if you know who he is, I would say raise your hand, but I can't see you. So some of you will have guessed that was Cecil Rhodes. Right? And he was so audacious that he went into Zimbabwe and changed the country after himself. He changed the name of it to Rhodesia. They have since, of course, changed it back. And then on the left here we have our first, Minister of Indigenous Affairs, who said very sort of blatantly in the House of Commons that, this is all about assimilation. So our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. And that's the whole object of this residential school bill. So we don't have to, sort of beat around the bushes in terms of knowing that assimilation has been a long-standing approach of our governments, of successive governments. And the Sixties Scoop is an extension of that. So, again, one of my driving questions was, what is this thing that I'm hearing about, this 60s Scoop? And it's the large-scale apprehension of Indigenous children that really took root as the residential schools started to decline and fall into disrepair. And it was, the wholesale removal and placement into non-Indigenous homes. So the term was coined by Patrick Johnston, a social worker. He wrote a report for I think it was the Ontario federal government in 1983. And the quote came from a social worker by the name of Bridget Moran, who was working in BC. She wrote a book called A Little Rebellion. And what Bridget said was that they were scooping kids and placing them into homes about which they knew nothing. She said, no matter how we cloaked our actions in child welfare jargon, we were putting those children at risk. And she said that the BC government was the biggest contributor to child abuse in the province. Now, when she came out with these comments, of course, you can imagine how the BC government responded. And what happened was she was fired and vilified and made to look as if she was crazy. So some of the news reports from the day, were less than flattering. But she persisted, and she continued to advocate for children and child welfare reform for the next 50 years, and just passed away a few years ago. So that's a picture of Bridget, and she's a settler woman. but she was honored in a blanketing ceremony by one of the West Coast nations for the work that she did, because they recognized her efforts, at least to make a change. And again, I just want to say, like, I'm not opposed to child welfare. I think that we're very fortunate in Canada to have social safety nets that extend to things like income assistance and child welfare and supports for single parents and daycare and those sorts of things, daycare subsidies. Um, but I think that there's a line that we need to really be careful of, and that's sort of where my focus of concern is. There were so many people that did really good work and did it with the best of intentions, and I'll get to that a little bit more later. So, but what we know now is between 1951 and 1991, approximately, and this is an actuary who did actual calculations based on um, provincial and Indian Affairs data, that approximately 22,400 status Indian and Inuit children were placed into primarily non-Indigenous foster and adoptive homes. And if the Métis are included, then we're looking at, I'm guessing, and I've been pretty accurate so far. I'm guessing it's between another 15 to 25,000. So we would be looking at between like 35 and 50,000 children altogether who were dislocated. Hundreds and hundreds went to the Midwest states, and then we have a dispersal that's global. So we have children, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, South America, Central America, and many in Europe as well, England and Europe. I don't know of any who so far who have been to Africa or any of the countries in Asia. So Scotland, Ireland, England, and so on. And then lots of within Canada dislocation. And so what I mean by that is children who were, who could have been fostered or adopted in one province, but for some reason were removed to a different province. And I think this. I hear echoes of the Jesuits when I think about this. It's that separation. That if there was a little bit of extra geographical separation, then that would ensure that the children would be in a context where they could be more easily assimilated. So this map is an early iteration of it's part of the project. And what happened was my friend Colleen Cardinal, who's a 60 Scoop activist in Ontario, she had this idea about doing an online platform where we could actually have a visual, an interactive GIS map to show the 60 Scoop diaspora globally. And so there's the link right there if you want to jot it down. And if you are a 60 Scoop person, you can put your information in there and and tell your story, upload stories, videos, whatever you want. But also have a chance to see. Anybody can go and look at some of the stories. Just click on the numbers and you'll sort of dive in further and further, and you'll find me in there. I haven't. I want to upload a video, tell a little bit about my story. But so that's one of the outcomes of the project. But it's really Colleen's brainchild, and it was also highlighted on National Geographic. It's quite innovative. So here's sort of a general timeline. So in the 40s and 50s, I mean, the residential schools ran from about the 1840s until the 1940s, 50s, when they started to fall into disrepair. And then we have the scoop from about the 50s to, and I say 1985, even though we still have children who are being scooped, just in a different sort of context. It was all augmented through the 1966 Canada Assistance Plan that created transfers to provinces for things like social services and child welfare. And so we see an increase sort of in provincial involvement and jurisdiction in the lives of Indigenous people. The next key point would be about 1983 with this Supreme Court case. And what's significant about this particular case, Racine and Woods, is that the precedent that it set is really the basis for any removal of Indigenous children and their placement into non-Indigenous families to this day. And it's used in almost every single child welfare case. In 1985, they had the Kimmelman moratorium or inquiry in Manitoba, where Indigenous people had started to push back. And Wayne Christian in BC was one of the most staunchest advocates. He was the youngest chief ever elected. And he was elected on a child welfare platform because he had been removed from his community, and saw just the devastation that it had in communities. And so he lobbied, Justice Edwin Kimmelman. Kimmelman did an inquiry and found that the case files, were atrocious. The system was really problematic, and what he concluded was that cultural genocide had been occurring without a doubt. Particularly because so many children were removed to the States, and there were some questionable financial arrangements in that regard. The next sort of significant, what happened with the Kimmelman moratorium is Manitoba said, okay, no more adoption of Indigenous children into non-Indigenous homes. And other provinces, even though they didn't implement moratoriums, they followed suit. And so from 85 until, into the 2000s, we see this real increase of Indigenous children into foster care and institutional care. And in 1985, there was a case in Saskatchewan, and the decision by Justice Ryan Frostley, she said that, every child deserves a permanent home. And so we have to make this work, basically. And what it did was it sort of opened the gates again for adoptions to happen, but with more consultation with bands. So bands had to be involved. And then after 2005, I think because adoption was more difficult to achieve, what we see is what I'm calling the foster care scoop. And it's that our children are still being removed en masse at an alarming frequency into the foster care system. And policies and legislation have evolved so that, that enable this to happen. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. And it's led to a foster care economy. And I think that economies, once they've been established, they're really hard to sort of, they're really hard to disrupt, because there's a lot of investment. As human beings, we like money, and when sources of money start to be threatened, then there's resistance to that. So the foster care scoop then is that our children are being scooped through the foster care system. So some social workers, and I've heard this from 3 social workers in different provinces, saying that they've been advised, they're advising foster parents or potential adoptive parents to avoid the adoption route because it will take too long. So what they say is, if you want a child, you can foster a child and then you'll be able to keep them. And that's a quote. Now, what's worrying about this is that foster care is supposed to be, a temporary sort of commitment by benevolent folks, well-intentioned benevolent folks to take care of a child temporarily, and yet we have now, when social workers are going and saying, okay, we're gonna make a plan to return the child home, all the foster parents have to do is say no. Agencies have implemented policies to allow them to then go to court to make a petition to keep the child. And once the case goes to court, lawyers use this Racine and Woods argument, and inevitably foster families win. I have consulted as an expert witness on, I think, 7 or 8 cases now, and we've lost every single one of them. So we keep struggling against this sort of this push to continue removing the children. And my solution is that across the board, so if you work in an agency, or if you have any sort of bureaucratic power, we need to implement legally binding foster care agreements in every child welfare agency across the country. And these agreements would simply be for foster parents to honor the temporary nature of fostering. Because, this isn't to disparage foster families. I think it's a really noble thing to take care of children and nurture them and care for them when their parents can't. And but it is temporary, and that needs to sort of be the bottom line. So this case I want to talk about a little bit, and I know I'm speaking a little bit fast, but that's because I don't have much time and I've got so much information that I want to share. So just bear with me. This is interesting stuff, and it's a little bit scary too. So this case, Racine and Woods, the foster parents, it's this little girl, the foster parents wanted to keep her. And the mother had given her to them because she knew she couldn't take care of her at that time. And then when she went back to get her daughter, they said no. And so the mother just went and picked her up from school. And, then she was arrested and there was a big brouhaha. It made its way to the Supreme Court. So first, the parents were given custody and then the mother appealed. The parents were given custody and then the mother appealed. And then, and she lost at the appeal. And then it went to this, no, she won at the appeal and then it went to the Supreme Court. The Racines took it to the Supreme Court and they won. And how they won was that one of the Supreme Court justice who rendered the decision, she made two statements. She said, over time, for children who are in foster care, the significance of culture abates. So she said it gets less somehow. I'm not sure what this was founded on. And she said the second one is that precedence has to be given to the bonding that this child has with foster parents. So if they've been in care for it could be 6 months or it could be 5 years, then clearly they've bonded with the foster parents and that shouldn't be disrupted. So she said, a child should not be allowed to become a battleground in the courts or in the media. When the test to be met is the best interest of the child, the significance of cultural background and heritage as opposed to bonding abates over time. Now, as a researcher and academic, I've studied this case a lot, and I've also studied bonding and attachment and cultural identity. And what I found is that in research, neither of her arguments are true, and they're in fact based on sort of fancy and fiction. The problem is that, and the reason that I say based on fiction is because, first of all, in my research, what I found is that 99% of Indigenous children who are adopted reacculturate, and they reacculturate because as they get older, it becomes more important for them to find out who they are, who their people are, who their communities are, who their families are. And in very rare cases, there have been adoptees and even foster kids who said, I've taken on the culture of my adoptive family and I'm happy with that. I was like, more power to you. Now those individuals, the 2 or 3 that I met, acknowledged that even though they were happy in their family and they had a Brady Bunch wonderful experience and very close to their family and extended family and the culture, even they still didn't escape the effects of racism and discrimination. And then the other piece around attachment is that attachment is an interesting thing because when I looked at the research, for the most part, when we look at research attachment in cases of fostering and adoption, almost invariably the determinations around how attached the children are based on the parents reporting, because there's no way to measure in a young child how attached they are. And there's been research in the area that shows that even children who are not even in an adoption context, so children in any family, they can actually become unattached if the family life is chaotic, and chaotic can include divorce, substance abuse, verbal violence, frequent moving and that sort of thing. And my contention is that the adoption context itself it creates chaos because it changes the family completely. I'm still sort of unpacking how my own placement into this family I think it had a profound impact on every member of that family. And, that's a perspective that I need to look at some point. So both of those arguments are really flawed, and they're flawed based on empirical evidence. The problem is that Supreme Court decisions are precedents, and so they're binding to lower courts. So whether they're flawed or not, all a lower court has to do is, utter the case, and the judge is bound to take it into consideration in making the determination in the case. So the other thing that happens in child welfare, or that has happened in the last 10 to 15 years, is that the legal and policy systems have created delays in these cases. And this delay argument feeds right into the attachment, the longevity of attachment in child welfare and kids who are in foster care. So it's really problematic. So the economy, just a quick word about this. Um, and, I just sort of did this very quickly a few years back because I heard Cindy Blackstock talk. And so I put dollar figures to it. And this is a very conservative estimate. So I've seen foster care rates at between $26 and $76 a day. So I took a middle of the road amounts, and I really sort of underestimated in each of these. So in Cindy's research, what she said is that they calculated between 1989 and 2012 that Indigenous children had spent the equivalent of 66 million nights in care. So when we multiply that by $50 a day or $50 a night for foster care, that comes out to $3.4 billion. And so then when we add and this is conservative as well, $12.50 a day child tax benefit that ordinarily goes to parents or should go to foster parents, I think. That money goes into provincial coffers, so that's another I think over $1 billion. And we know that the Indigenous population is not, it's not sort of evenly scattered across the country. So if we divide that among the six most populous provinces, and then divide that by 12, what we're looking at is about $3 million per month into provincial agencies. That's a significant amount of money, and a huge incentive, for to maintain the status quo of the Indigenous child welfare system. And all what we know is that up to 90% of all children in care in some provinces are Indigenous. So the child welfare system really does hinge upon Indigenous children and families. So these dollar amounts don't include federal transfers for infrastructure, health, education, or other expenditures for special needs kids. So this is a tremendous amount of money that's invested into the Indigenous child welfare system. And I already mentioned about the legally binding foster care agreements, and I like to repeat myself to when I have an important point to get through. So this is part of my team. This is actually my community advisory board. So I have also a team of 24 investigators across the country, and collaborators as well in 60 Scoop organizations across the country. And so the last meeting we had was I think it's about 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. It was in the dead of winter, and we just sort of on the spur of the moment, I had been to a 60 Scoop gathering. There's a woman in the blanket in the middle, and then to her left, well, her right, but our left, that's Colleen Cardinal. And she organized 4 annual gatherings of survivors and managed to raise an incredible amount of money to bring us from all across Canada to these culture camps that were a week long for 4 years in a row. And at the one before this winter gathering here, I was given this blanket. We were all given blankets in a little ceremony, and I wanted to pass this on. And so we did a little impromptu sort of blanketing, and that individual is Latisha Racine. And Latisha is the child who is the subject of that Supreme Court case. And it's interesting because in a news report, she said, I was a total pawn of the system. The judge said that children shouldn't be, but she said she was. Her what she wanted wasn't taken into account, and she spent the bulk of her adult life reacculturating and trying to make those connections with family and community. And Elder Mir Campbell is in there, Banaconda Kennedy, Kish Bell is the bottom right there. She's elder from Ontario. Betty Ann Adams, some of you will recognize. She might even be watching this right now. Melody Wood, another awesome adoptee who works at the Saskatchewan Indian Cultural College. And then some of my researchers are in this picture as well. And the gentleman there with his on his one knee there is Dale Spencer. And he's a phenomenal investigator from Ontario who approached me. He's in criminology and law, and he he said he was doing a project on homelessness in Ottawa, and he said he was astonished to discover that almost every single person he encountered, Indigenous person he encountered in doing his interviews with homeless men, came out of the child welfare system, and he wanted to know why and what was happening. And so when he did research on it, he came across my name and invited me for coffee at Starbucks in Ottawa one day when I happened to be there for another meeting, and we've been collaborating ever since. And he's one of those good guys who does amazing work. So here's just some visual entertainment for you. Some of my amazing trainees. That's This is at the Saskatchewan Archives Board, I think in Regina. That's Priscilla Ferreira da Silva and Scott. Sorry, I've forgotten his last name. One of my students, and they've become among the best researchers I know, and archival researchers. They know more about accessing archival files than I do. Here's an image from Ottawa, and they spent many days and hours going through files at the library and archives there. And this is at Winnipeg. And so when I say files, some of those boxes, would be considered a file. So the box might contain, up to 3,000 pages. So we have amassed over 40,000 pages of archives. And you can see here that there's 323 files there, 490 there, and I think about 80 something from Saskatchewan. And then here's Vancouver, where we ordered 190 files. And then one of my former project coordinator, who's now just about to complete her PhD in the area of child welfare, Dana Lee Youngwolf. And then here's just some samples from the archives. And now when you go into archives, some of them are protected. So none of the images you will see are protected documents. They're public access. I can't show you the protected archives. But that process, we're in year 5, and we applied for most of these files in year 1, and some of them we're just getting now. So we've just recently been able to access some of the files in Regina. So here's one that says, please confirm, this is from Indian Affairs, an Indian Affairs form. Please confirm that the above named children are of at least 50% North American Indian blood. This documentation is requested for possible adoption placement in the United States of America. Thank you for your cooperation. And here's one. This is the AIM program, September of 1966, and it was an application, and the project was a demonstration project, Special Adoption Unit to place Indian and Métis children. And what's really important about AIM is that it's really been mischaracterized. And I think, one of my goals is to sort of correct people's perceptions, because AIM didn't scoop children. AIM, it was child protection that removed children. AIM was the brainchild of a number of, awesome people who saw that there was a need for children to have permanency, and really, wanted to implement this program where children would be placed in permanent homes. And it's one of those, it's kind of the perfect example of one of those times where, the sort of the meta level or the higher level of government assimilation doesn't necessarily translate, on the ground. Because on the ground we have people, who care about children and really want to see children out of institutional and foster care and into permanent homes. And, to me, that's a really noble pursuit. And yet, when you're busy doing your work, sometimes, you don't necessarily know what's going on at the federal level in terms of policy. And I think really when we look back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and before, that's been true. I think that nowadays we have so many more people who are researchers and aware of sort of our colonial history, that when new policies come out, people are on it to understand, how does this fit in the bigger picture of colonialism or neo-colonialism, and what are the implications? Yeah. So so AIM, I think, sort of got thrown under the bus a little bit, and it's important that we I think it's really important to honor the fact that sometimes the people were working in child welfare and they may not have known, the big picture of it as a colonial project to dislocate Indigenous people, but they did the best they could with what they knew at the time, and they have my respect for that. And so this one is 1968. This is a news release to show that this project has much promise. So in the year before the project, there were 16 children of Indian and Métis ancestry who were placed, and then under AIM, there were 46 who were adopted, and then they had 170 who were waiting. So that certainly matches with the material. Now I want to get into some of the other data that we've collected, and I took liberties to steal the incredible slides from my research team. I think this is the other piece. There's so many pieces that are really enlightening when you're a researcher. So one is, really being able to understand history and make corrections when you have misperceptions, like in terms of the AIM program. The other one is, learning the stories from people, the stories from the survivors, of the people who have gone through the experience. And, not all characterize their experience as a survivor. Some of them call themselves thrivers. If they had a really positive experience, it's like, I was just adopted. And, but learning the stories is just absolutely fascinating, because there's 24,600 status and Inuit kids, then there's 24,600 stories. And I love listening to every single one of them. Well, almost every single one of them. And then we have archival documents and newspapers and so on. So this is just an example of some of our files that we have. So here's the collection. It comes from SAB, is the Saskatchewan Archives Board. Now, and comes from our master list, which is pages and pages long. It's just this massive Excel sheet. And this is just like 5 lines, but we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of different lines. So it just gives you an example of how you have to structure archives when you go through them. And we have actual links to the archives so that we can quickly pull them up. So it takes a tremendous amount of data management. And then from our archives, from all of our research, we create code books. And so themes. So here we've got adoption programs, and then you've got your sub-themes under that. So there's AIM, criticisms of AIM, then another iteration was ARENA, and then it evolved into REACH. We've got today's child advertisements. We have thousands of those images. So our code books as well are extremely extensive. And then we have code books as well from our interviews. So we've done over 80 qualitative interviews with adoptees, about just under, I think around 9 with surviving child welfare and workers and bureaucrats. And then just a small group, I think maybe 4 or 6 adoptive parents. That was a very hard group to access, and I think probably workers as well, because they've aged, many are aging, but difficult to access adoptive parents, because I think many of them are struggling with the publicity around the class action lawsuit. But this is a little snapshot, and it's so what the theme here is apprehension, and you'll see that like under apprehension, we've got dozens of sub-themes, and so we've got over, I think, close to 600 themes, primary themes, and probably several thousand sub-themes. There's an image of our recruitment poster that was posted online and handed around. So our participant breakdown, which is probably consistent. I mean, this was done a couple of years ago, but it's probably fairly consistent. So BC, the Prairies, Ontario, the USA, other unknown. And again, this would make sense because Ontario, the Prairies, and BC, were sort of the highest numbers of adoptions. And then we also gathered demographic data. And because the project was quite comprehensive, we asked them if they would be willing to participate in an interview, a focus group, the GIS mapping that I gave you the link for. Would they be willing to do share their photo or video? Would they be willing? Do they have their case file, and would they be willing to share that? Because one aspect that we probably don't have the money to do at this point, we'll have to seek more funds, is to look at the case files, because I wanted to know what information in those case files was accurate, and then did it sort of meet with adoptive family, their expectations, and for survivors who then got to access their case files, did it come as a surprise to them? Was it accurate? And the reason I ask is because my own non-identifying information, I wondered sometimes if it was just a form because it was so inaccurate. They said that I had musical talent, and I don't, and a number of other things that just were not were not accurate. So my poor mother, with her best of intentions, she put me in every single music lesson she could think of, trying to access this musical talent that I allegedly had, but I didn't. So of course everybody wants the final report. And what was interesting to me is we asked people if they wanted to be identified in the reports, and the majority said yes. And so we'll honor that in certain instances. In other instances, we will use confidentiality. But the voices of participants, again, this is one of the most profound aspects of doing research, is we get the chance to listen to stories. And for the people who went through the experience, I thought I was the only one, and I wasn't the only one that thought that. And I never really had a chance to share that with people. So that's something that really comes up for people is, I can't believe I get to share my story now, and it's about time. This is so we've collected through Zotero, which is a document management system. We've collected, I'd say, thousands of resources and articles on anything related to the 60s Scoop and child welfare in Canada. I would say it's probably one of the most comprehensive collections that we have. And some of them are really awesome. It took us a while to find them. Like 100 Years of Child Welfare Services in Saskatchewan, a survey by Dornstadter and Macnac. I mean, that's kind of gold when you're doing child welfare, when you're doing historical research, because it fills in lots of blanks. And then we have the research, some other amazing researchers in the province, like Alison Stevenson, who's part of the team. She did her dissertation on the Scoop from a Métis perspective, and it's a brilliant thesis as well. And then so this sort of is a deeper dive into it. So we have then CBC News articles, and in any of these we've got quite a significant collection. And I'm looking forward to having another student come in, because I'll get them to update and add sort of new ones, because in the last few years we've just had this sort of explosion of reporting on 60s Scoop and child welfare issues. And again, so this is the Star Phoenix, so 42 items in here, and there's probably another couple hundred to go. So some of the outcomes of the project, which have been quite significant, is that we have, we've written two chapter contributions to textbooks. I did one for a collection out of the States, and then Dale and I did one for a collection in Canada. We've done two articles, and if you want to find them, the one is Advertising Happy Children. And it's looking at the wording that was used. We're going to be doing a third one on the language that's used in the advertisements, in terms of gender and role and that sort of thing. So Advertising Happy Children, you'll find that one, and the lead author on that one is one of our PhD students, Danielle Bendo. And the second one is Search for Their Reward Will Be a Lovely Daughter, and the lead on that is Taryn Hepburn. And then Dale Spencer and I are both authors on that as well. But those are both around how children are sort of constructed for the purposes of adoption. I was invited to consult on a feature film which was released in 2018. It's called Trouble in the Garden. You might still be able to see it for free on CBC Gem. And I've also been invited to collaborate on a TV series and a play that's going to be produced in Ontario. We have, easily, between Dale and I, over 15 public presentations. My own researchers participated with me in doing training in qualitative data analysis, Indigenous sort of framed qualitative data analysis, uh, untold media interviews. I was invited to be an expert witness in the Brown and Commanda, no, sorry, an expert advisor to the interim working table that came out of the Brown and Commanda class action lawsuit, and that was sort of the precursor body to the current Healing Foundation board of directors. So that was an incredible privilege. This GIS mapping platform was featured in National Geographic and CBC, and then the training of students. So we've trained about 6 undergraduate and 4 or 5 graduate students, and we have 2 or 3 who are doing their PhDs right now. And in terms of this, I mean, the my team. So Hannah Malloy, Priscilla Ferreira de Silva, who's doing her master's over at Manitoba, Jenny Gardepy, who's doing her PhD at U of Sask here, our Ottawa researcher, Taryn Hepburn, who's doing her PhD. They've become some of the best archival researchers around. I would pit them against any archival team in the country. And I mean, what an incredible skills they've developed, and they're so incredibly organized. I would be absolutely lost without them. And here's an example of something they've done. So how to work as a team in Atlas TI, which is a qualitative analysis program, and how to coordinate themselves and organize themselves. So guidelines for coding. So I'm going to encourage them to do some publications on team qualitative analysis in Indigenous context. So as I come to a close, because I know this is a lunch hour, I just want to let people know that one of the big advantages, or one of the gifts of our experiences is that many of us, we have this opportunity to reacculturate. And what a culture we have to reacculturate into. It's just phenomenal. It's where we find out who we are, we connect to our families, we learn from elders, we attend ceremonies, sun dances, fasts, vision quests. And these teachings are very profound and sacred. And for many of us, they've helped us to really not only discover who we are as Indigenous people, but also to understand and contextualize our own experiences and the purpose for them in the greater scheme of our lives. So for me, I'm a communications trainer, and I do workshops on lateral violence intervention, cross-cultural communication. And I have to say, some of the experiences I had with my mother, even though they were extremely difficult, the things I mean, as a kid, you just react, right? So I would react with like fear and hypervigilance and dissociation. I was sexually abused in foster care. And so I dissociated and sort of floated off outside of myself until I started to do my healing work. But all of those experiences, I would not wish them on anybody. But now that I have done the intense work to recover, there's a gift to be found in those, and I draw upon those gifts in the work that I do. So I can sit in a room with people, and even online when I can see people. Now I'm just looking at my own PowerPoint and I can see a few faces here. Um, I see everything. I see everything because that's the gift out of hypervigilance. I mean, now that I don't suffer from it, I can use those skills and I see everything. And I tell students, I see when you're looking at your phone. I see your level of attentiveness. And, I know when I need to get everybody to stand up and do a little stretching because I've lost their attention. But so even in difficult circumstances, we can find gifts out of that as long as we do the work to recover. And as I want to finish with in the spirit of Cindy Blackstock's words, you know, she said, "Let's be the first to raise a generation of children who do not have to recover from their childhoods." And I would say we are doing that. And although my daughter, I always have pictures of her because I'm understanding orders to have pictures of her in my presentations, and she is a going concern. She is the love of my life, and I get to do this parenting thing with her in a differently than was done with me. And she takes full advantage of it, and is so honest with me, and lets me know that she's taking advantage. Um, but I think this is why, as an Indigenous researcher, I was motivated initially to find out what happened to me, and now I'm motivated to make sure that it doesn't happen to other kids. And I think that, once we know better, we should do better. And I don't know who said that, but they were a smart person, because I don't think we should do away with the child welfare system. There are lots of instances where kids need protection, and but now that we know better, we can do better, and we need to find ways to come together and put in, make those changes, make those adaptations, so that kids really do benefit and are nurtured and loved in the way that they're meant to be, because they're sacred. They're the future, and we want kids to be full of beans and feisty and ready to take on the world and enjoy living. So thank you so much for listening. I love doing research, and if you have any, if you want to pursue research, if you're an undergraduate student, I've got some good tips for you. Um, but thank you so much. Gratitude, all my relations.
Thank you, Dr. Sinclair. Hertha, do you have maybe a question that we can fit in before we do close?
Yes, I got about three. The first one is from Vidya. Why has the Canadian government failed to implement legislation like the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act in the US to prevent further scooping? What can we do as white settlers to answer the persistent racism in Canada's child welfare system?
That's a great question, Hertha, and I thank you for it. In January of last year of 2020, Bill C-92 did come into effect, and it is an act that allows for the transfer of jurisdiction over children to Indigenous bands and communities. So in the last year and a half, what bands are doing across the country is they're quite hastily, I mean, a year isn't much time in developing policies and legislation, but they're developing band bylaws, and in some instances, I think bands are going to stick with their tribal council approach, but they're developing their legislation, so their acts, in order to take over jurisdiction of child welfare. And so it's an opportunity really for Cowessess has just done it. If you want an example of a community that's really been proactive and moved forward, just take a look at some of what Cowessess has done. They have jurisdiction now, and they've been in negotiations with the federal government and the provinces, and I mean, the detail is just phenomenal. Like it's even things like, how do they make the transfer of child tax benefits for kids who are in care, from the province to the new jurisdiction of the band or the tribal council. And then how do they deal with like things like where kids are in institutional care because they're extremely high needs, right? If the band suddenly has jurisdiction, are they going to move the children? Is the band going to have the resources to manage those particular cases? So there's lots of negotiation that's going on right now. One thing that I do know from my research is that policies may be really great, and the intention is really good. But when it comes down to sort of the front line, and financial assistance is a good example. And if anybody works in financial assistance, don't take this personally, but financial support, right? Welfare, if you've come across hard times, is an important thing. The people at the front line might not necessarily have that benevolent approach when they're dealing with clients. And that's sort of, that's the human sort of frailty that we have, is that sometimes people aren't nice. And so, how do we, in social work and in child welfare worker courses, I think we do our best to try train future social workers to conduct themselves in an ethical way. I mean, they're bound by the code of ethics, but we can't guarantee that, right? Once they're out there and they're working, and maybe they've got a little bit of power. Um, do we have control over them to ensure that their behavior is always aligned with ethics? We just have to look at that situation last week with that worker in Calgary who was, she's in the higher levels of child protection administration, and she's swearing at this woman, who's sort of staging a little bit of a protest, but she's like swearing, using the F-bomb on national TV, um, with a really, it's really sort of a stereotypical response. She said, if you don't want us to take your effing kids, then you should effing take better care of them, right? And on one level, it's like, okay. On another level, it's like that statement doesn't take into account, 300, 500 years of colonialism that has put people in a really vulnerable situation, where when social workers decide to, because of there's provincial birth alerts across the country, if a worker decides to come in and take your child, they can, because the policies are in place. So is that about taking care, or is that about abuse of power? So every situation, I mean, what I do is, I sometimes, if I think, how am I going to make these changes, it's like, I we do the best we can. And when I am teaching students, I talk to them about those issues. I talk to them about, when you get into a position of power and authority, as human beings, there was this man who said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think, when we look at residential schools, that was the situation. So those people may have been, well-intentioned Catholics, but once they had children in these completely vulnerable situations, then their worst came out. And I think that can be true in some of our bureaucracies. And when we see people who are conducting themselves, spewing racism and that sort of thing, something's going on where they feel enabled to do that. So as a teacher, then as a professor, I bring those issues to students' attention and say, how are you going to, regulate yourself as a professional to conduct yourself, in the most competent way you can, given policy and procedure and all the things that you have to attend to. How are you going to resist the temptation of being mean to a client because you can, because you're in a position of power over them? And it's important that we bring those up, because otherwise the risk is they get into those positions, they've never had anybody, ask them to think about it, and so they just, conduct themselves however they want. But I've had the fortune to meet many faculty and students across the country, through the Canadian Association for Social Work Education. And social work is a noble profession. We really do, I think we really do go into it with the best of intentions to help other people. And we get in our own ways as human beings, and that's one of the problems with having free will. One of the gifts, and then uh, problems with having free will. But we do what we can. We do the best that we can, and each of us has to do that. I think we have to take that responsibility to do the best that we can.
Thank you everyone for joining us today and contributing to this very important conversation. And to you, Dr. Sinclair, for sharing your expertise and time. I also thought I was the only one. Thank you for
Yeah.
the work that you do on the 60 for the
And
60 communities.
thanks, Lori. I just need to interject, because I see Frank sitting there, and I see some other people who probably have been part of the system for a while, and I just want to thank you, and and honor you for the work that you've done, because I know your intentions were awesome, and yeah, I just really appreciate you, and coming and listening to me ramble. Man, I'm sure you have better things to do with your day, Frank. but all my respect.
Thank you, Raven. And yes, thank you, Frank, for joining us. And thank you for, your work, Raven, because it does, it's helped all of us understand, those of us that were part of the 60 Scoop and about the AIM program, about, government policies at the time and how everything kind of came together. But just, my deep appreciation for all your work that you've done.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
So a video of today's Research with Impact lecture will be posted soon on the alumni section of our website. A link to our website can be found in the chat, and I encourage you to share that link with your family and friends so that they also can learn. Don't forget to check the University of Regina website for information on upcoming events in this series and more. Our next Research with Impact lecture is on July 20th, features Dr. Andrew Cameron, who is a molecular microbiologist with a specialty in infectious diseases. He is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Regina, and he'll be speaking on the COVID-19 pandemic, variants of concern, and vaccinations. Until then, everyone, be well, stay safe, and enjoy this beautiful summer weather. Thank you.